All right, welcome. Hi, I'm Luke Johnson. I'm the author of the Public Sphere newsletter. I'm pleased to welcome Phillips O'Brien, who is professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews. He writes Phillips newsletter on Substack, which which is very focused on the Ukraine war as well as other topics. And he's the author of a new book called War and Power: Who Wins Wars and Why. We're going to talk about the book as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine, which Phillips is a keen observer of. So my first question to you is, what is the great power paradigm that you think is wrong?
Well, by the way, thanks for having me on, Luke. The great power paradigm is beloved of a certain group in international relations scholarship, and which basically says that the world is divided up between great powers and lesser powers, and great powers are ones that can sort of throw their weight around and get what they want, and in some ways, lesser powers have to defer to great powers. I think it's a really problematic concept, and I've argued that the whole thing should be junked for a number of ways. One, there's no definition of what makes a great power. Yeah, that even those who talk about great powers don't agree on what makes a great power, and you have different definitions over history. I talk about some in the book that stretch to the most extreme, that a great power is a power that can fight every other power. Well, by that definition, there might not have been a great power. Whereas others are saying, well, a great power is one with a strong military. So they said Russia before the Ukraine invasion was a great power. So it just doesn't work for me as a phrase, as a concept. And the other thing is, it seems to be more a prophecy than an analytical tool, because it's almost like a title. You give someone the title of great power, or a country the title of a great power, as, by the way, was given to Russia. And that sort of makes you almost pay attention to them more and consider their opinion more, and make you more almost genuflection to their needs. And lesser powers, like Ukraine, are not given that kind of attention. But that can simply be wrong. You might not understand power, and I would argue a lot of the realists who talk about great powers don't understand power in the way that they thought they did, and that's why using the phrase caused a lot of problems. And so I just think we should junk the whole thing. I would just get rid of the great power phrase. And in the book, I talk about replacing it with something called a full spectrum power, which makes you think across different elements of power, and that would be a better way to approach the question?
Okay, so what's we'll talk about what makes powers full spectrum, but what's not important in your framing? Like what are the characteristics that you don't think are important?
Well, not I mean, I don't wanna say anything's not important.
Okay.
What I was trying to say is, if you judge a power by how big its military is, which was what was being done by Russia before the Russo-Ukraine war, or the full-scale Russian invasion. If you just do it by looking at the military, you're gonna miss a lot. Because the military is not something in and of itself. It is a product. It is created. And it's created by a host of other factors that will tell you more about the power of the state involved than the military at the beginning of a war itself. So it's created by the economic and technological capabilities of that power. It's created by the leadership. It's created by the society, by the political structure. So it's saying, that you have to understand it's these elements that really matter more than the outward manifestation of the military.
Okay, let's get into these elements. And the first one you mentioned is economic and technological strength. I think everybody knows what that is.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Who has
Well, they in
advantages
many
and
ways they do,
disadvantage?
and I would argue they don't.
Yeah,
That they're just being rich, by the way, is not in and of itself the important. You can be rich, but if you're a resource extraction economy,
like
and
Russia is.
you get your money by pulling things out of the ground and selling them on the market. Actually, you're not as rich. You're not as strong as someone who can design and build and make the most high tech goods. So yeah, that money obviously matters, but it's a certain kind of money. That's why I was referring to economic technological power. That it's not just having access to capital; it's having the ability to use the capital, and take part in the most highly advanced technological aims. And that this is the foundation of power. And that was why Russia was always being overrated. I mean, the Russian economy wasn't that large anyway. I mean, the Russian
About the size of
economy,
Italy's. Yeah.
yeah, no, not even
Yeah.
close. I don't think. I
Yeah.
think it was more the size of Spain.
Okay.
Spain or Canada. So okay, it'd be close to Italy, but below Italy. But even then, it didn't have a lot of high tech skill. I mean, what was the last Russian made high tech good you bought? They're not
Right.
they're not they're not a lot out there. And so that they had certain limitations, and those limitations meant I would have never considered Russia to be a great power. It fell at the first hurdle because it didn't have the economic strength to be one.
Okay. But what do like you've probably seen Russia has a capacity to build all sorts of drones which aren't necessarily high tech. In fact, they're pretty low tech,
Yeah.
but it does, cause a lot of destruction nevertheless.
Yeah, against Ukraine, which has an
Yeah.
even smaller. I mean,
Right,
what we
right,
have seen is Russia throw its entire economy into a war with Ukraine and
right,
still struggle to a great
right,
degree. Yeah, the Russian military power, Russia has shown itself to be a very limited economic technological power, and it's received a lot of support from allies to do that.
right,
So the Chinese have given it a huge amount of economic support and components. The North Koreans have given it a great deal of support with artillery shells and soldiers. The Iranians provide the regional Shahed drones. India has bought a lot of Russian oil. So to me, Russia's, even with receiving a great deal of aid, has
right.
struggled in a war with Ukraine, which I think is indicative of if you can't make up economic technological power on the spot. It just doesn't. You just
Sure,
can't do that.
sure. So let's talk about allies. Who would you say has the edge here? I mean, you just listed a number of allies that Russia has.
That's a great. I mean, well, let's talk about conceptually about allies first. The
Yeah,
book
okay.
has chapters on allies, both on power and war. It's another reason I dislike the great power idea. There are no great powers, but you might say they're great alliances.
Sure.
That great alliances are usually what determines international relations and then eventually wins wars, whereas powers acting on their own rarely do. You might say that in the Cold War, the difference between the United States and the Soviet Union was that their alliance structures were utterly different. The United States had really powerful allies, and sometimes difficult for them, but that's fine because they were democracies, but powerful economic allies who had large militaries who were part of an alliance that was successful. And the Soviet Union's allies were basically prisoners. That
Right.
Eastern Europe, who they had to keep under lock and key before, or else they would run away. So that looking just at the U.S. and the Soviet Union, for instance, didn't tell you a lot about the Cold War.
Sure.
You needed to look at the alliances. Now, what does this mean about Russia, Ukraine? In many ways, you could say the behavior of the alliances or the allies, and ally in this sense doesn't mean formally pledged to fight, though the North Koreans have fought for the Russians. But the behavior of the allies has been the most important shaping variable in this war because it's played a huge role in what the war has become. So Ukraine has received a good amount of aid from its allies, particularly under the Biden administration to begin with. However, it was very limited aid. And what the Ukrainians were receiving from the Biden administration in that aid was what you might call battlefield weapons. The Biden administration, until the very end, didn't want to give Ukraine the capacity to fire into Russia, didn't even want to at first give Ukraine the capacity to fire into Crimea. So the United States was giving them aid, but of a quite limited type, which forced the Ukrainians to fight on a battlefield, and to fight in the front line. And that was because of the alliance structure. Now, it's taken the Ukrainians 3.5 years to develop their own systems to break out of that. But it just shows the power of what an alliance does for both good and ill. For the Russians, as I said before, I don't think they would have been able to fight to this degree without their allies.
Yeah.
Their allies have politically basically given them stuff and said, "You do with it what you want." So the Russia's allies have been far more free in their
Right.
giving, that they haven't placed any limits on it. They've basically given Russia what they can and then say to Russia, okay, you do with it what you want. And in the case of North Korea, they've even given 10, 15, maybe 20,000 combat troops,
Right.
which were really important. So alliances, I mean, if you looked at this war as just Russia, Ukraine, you wouldn't quite understand what has happened.
Yeah, completely. I mean, and also like to your point about the limitations, North Korea, like these North Korean weapons have attacked civilians, which is an obvious war crime. And North
Yep.
Koreans haven't said, oh, you can't use this to strike Ukraine, obviously.
I don't think they
Um,
care. And
no,
the
they don't care,
Iranians
of
gave
course.
Shahed drones, and they
Yeah,
don't care about that.
they don't care either. So that's interesting. Um, let's talk about leadership. How do you define leadership?
Well, leadership is I don't define it, but I say
Okay.
it's a variable which really matters. And this
Yeah,
is one of the areas where, say, offensive realism really gets things wrong. And in many ways, a lot of IR theory gets things wrong. Because what we don't like to do is talk about leadership so much. We often talk about states and assume states have a similar behavior. So if you're an offensive realist, Mearsheimer, Waltz, these guys,
sure.
you say states all do basically the same thing. So what are all states trying to do? Well, all states are trying to maximize their power in a chaotic international system. All states are trying to get big and strong. They're all being driven by this you sort of basic impulse. The problem with that is if you look at states, they don't all act similarly. They act very differently at times. And often that difference comes down to who is leading them. I mean, not every German leader had to go to war in 1939. Adolf Hitler did. Not every Russian leader would have invaded Ukraine in 2022. Vladimir Putin did. So that you have to look at leaders to give you some idea of what a country might do or might not do. Sometimes leaders can be more restrained. So, Ronald Reagan might have reacted to the Russian attack on Ukraine differently than Joe Biden. There's no similarity in how they might have reacted to these things. But if you think all states behave the same and you discount leadership, what the book argues is you're going to miss a lot, and you're going to the nuance of how a state behaves will be lost on you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what these offensive realists do is it's like almost war is like a math problem. It's like, A plus B, then you'll get C in the outcome.
Yeah.
And then, when that doesn't happen, they have all these sort of like tortured explanations for that, or they have like a theory which is like, I'm a realist,
Yeah.
and this is what I think will happen in every conflict. And then that judges how I view events. But then like when things don't go that way, they don't have very many
Well,
answers. There are
they
very,
all
very
the
many
realists thought
solutions. Yeah.
they thought Russia was a great power and was going to conquer
Right.
Ukraine. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So you might say that they weren't geniuses when it comes to understanding power in 2022, though that doesn't stop them from claiming to be geniuses now. But they didn't understand power. In particular, I would say they didn't understand Ukrainian power.
Right.
That there was a real underrating of Ukraine that was going on up until February 2022. Oh, Ukraine really won't fight, or Ukraine's a small power, or Ukraine might even a lot of Ukrainians in the East would be happy to be Russian. There were a lot of basic, I would almost prejudices about what Ukraine was and why it was a small power. But actually, the Ukrainians were determined to fight, and they fought really well. And it also pointed out the basic problem with this idea of small power and weak power. Big powers lose. The United States lost the Vietnam War. Yeah, you could say the United States lost the war on terror. You
Yeah.
being a
Afghanistan and Iraq. Or,
Yeah, I mean, being
yeah.
a big great power doesn't make you win wars. And in many ways, we've seen great powers lose more wars over the
Right.
previous decades than win. So it just seems to me I don't know. It doesn't seem to me a really interesting way of understanding international relations.
So let's talk about a few more of these. So society and structure. Russia and Ukraine couldn't be more different. Russia's essentially a dictatorship, a
Yep.
despotism. it's very top down. Ukraine is incredibly horizontal.
Yep.
How is that impacted?
Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing. If you believe
Yeah,
all states behave the same and regime type doesn't matter, you're going to miss a lot of these elements. So you're basically going to miss things that make certain states fight well, certain states fight less well, or give advantages in one area or not. Say a dictatorship has an advantage; it can be decisive, but it has real disadvantages in the sense that the leaders believe that they know everything, and the longer a dictator is in power, the less likely they can take criticisms. So if you have a
right,
dictatorship, you're going to have one kind of system that is going to have maybe one or two advantages in some area, but some real disadvantages in others. Whereas democracies, or you might say more horizontally layered systems, might be more chaotic, might take longer to make decisions, but it can also have a lot more dynamism across the
hmm
board of how they react. So you need to look at these systemic differences, and you have to look at, by the way, societal differences. This was the kind of thing when about Ukrainian, we just assumed the Ukrainians had a weak society. They have a strong society and a strong identity.
right.
And so certain societies are going to have those strong identities and they're going to fight. And if you have a strong identity, you can fight a much larger power. Yeah,
Right. Yeah,
that's been
especially if it's on your home turf.
exactly. I mean,
Right.
if you have a society that has a strong identity and really wants to fight for itself, that's going to be a very hard nut to crack.
Right. 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 So how does this feed into constructing a military, which is one of
Yeah.
the other variables you talk about?
Well, basically, in other words, it builds the first part on power, builds to the building of the military. And what it says is okay, when you look at a military, don't look at just count the number of tanks or read its military doctrine. That's not going to tell you a lot. Look at these other characteristics and you'll understand it. So, what about the Russian military? Well, the Russian military was actually created by a relatively weak economy. So, it had what seemed to be a lot of frontline weapons, but its ability to sustain itself was relatively small in terms of making new advanced weapons during the war. It was led by a dictator named Vladimir Putin, and that was going to make a big difference in how it was going to fight. In many ways, it's meant that the Russians have sacrificed over 1 million of their own people to stay in the war. And you can say things that, in terms of its society, Russian society has been quite a mixed bag on this. There's corruption in Russian society, and that has made a real problem in Russia in its war effort to that point. And that affected its military. So the Russian military, which, by the way, before February 2022, the general analytical community and academic community was saying, oh, corruption's not a big problem in the Russian military. This had been corrected. But actually, these systemic problems and societal problems absolutely show themselves in the military. And they will make a big difference in the military more than adding up its tanks. So it just sort of tried to say, look at the military as a creation, a product, and don't get obsessed with looking at the military numerically.
I mean, it strikes me that this probably feeds into the kinds of people who lead a military, because if you have a dictatorship, then you're going to get the smartest people. Well, A, they've probably left the country, but B, if you have like a smart military general in a dictatorship, it's a threat to the leader potentially.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Putin on the
Yeah,
whole has surrounded himself with mediocrities.
right,
And yeah, who everyone, and I'm not an expert in the Russian military, but so I don't, want to say I know this, but people say the best Russian general so far in the war is one that he got rid of because he was worried about his loyalty, Suvrokin, who built
right,
the defensive line in 2023 for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. That he proved himself to probably be the most effective Russian commander, but Putin has real doubts about his loyalty because there was some question about whether Suvrokin was involved with Wagner. And because of that, he's gotten rid of them. And really, what we have in the Russian military has been a lot of, I would say, mediocre commanders. And Gerasimov, who is the head of the Russian military, and everyone says was a strategic genius, has not shown himself to be that. And that's quite typical of some dictators, particularly the longer a dictatorship's in power.
right.
The longer they're in power, they tend to to oppose, to be upset by any opposition, to be upset by independent thinking, and the more they go to yes men.
Right. So one of so actually before I get to that, um how often do you think these sort of pitfalls figure into American thinking? I mean, I'm thinking of the JD Vance op-ed in the New York Times, I believe in the summer of 2024, where he basically wrote, Ukraine should give it up. It's numerically numerically outgunned. We should focus on China. And then we've
Yeah,
been
they don't.
talking about we've been talking about the Biden administration. I mean, how pervasive is this thinking in sort of American
Well, I think you
strategic
would certainly
circles?
say among Trump and Vance that they believed Ukraine was doomed last year. They said it.
Yeah,
That Russia was going to crush Ukraine. Vance made it sound like Ukraine wasn't going to make it through 2025. So there's been because I think they have a very simple view of military power. They really thought Ukraine was going to do badly, and that Russia would automatically win the war. I think it just shows, their very limited view of war. They have changed their tune, particularly Trump has changed his tune recently. Now, we have to be careful with that because ultimately I still think Trump wants Putin to win, or he wants Putin to do well. But I
right.
think what they are running against is reality, that reality is more than just adding numbers on the battlefield, and that Ukraine has shown a kind of resilience that they were not expecting it to show. And so I think, that the American view of military power now and the present administration is rather worrying. I wrote a piece in the Atlantic about it that they seem to be having this idea that a military is like Rambo, and what you want to do is have a bunch of muscle laden soldiers charge at the enemy.
Unshackle people and
Yeah,
no
yeah.
beards and things like that. Yeah.
Or actually, a military is far more valuable if it thinks and is reflective and adaptive and knows how to use its equipment. That matters more than other things, but that is not the view I would say of the administration at present, sadly.
Yeah. I thought one of the really interesting points in the book is you talk about battles and what we think about battles, because I think we think war is a series of battles, and of course there are important ones. D-Day, very important, or
Well,
like what have you.
this
But
goes sort of to my view of war. I've written a lot on war before this book. I think,
yeah,
probably if you go back to the book "How the War Was Won," which is a history of victory and defeat in the Second World War. What the book tries to say is, all these discussions of battles, Kursk, Stalingrad, El Alamein, D-Day, are dramatic and they're very interesting, but actually very little equipment is destroyed in these battles in comparison to what is being made. So the actual result of the battle itself has a very little strategic impact on the kind of force that is being created at the time. So something like Kursk. Now, a lot of people listening here will probably have heard of the Battle of Kursk. It's a big tank battle between the Russians and the Germans in July of 1943, often seen as the last great German attempt at an offensive in the East. And it did have thousands of tanks on each side. And the first 10 days in particular, the Germans are trying to break through Russian lines, Soviet lines, sorry, and they can't do it. And it's often then seen as a decisive or turning point battle in the war. Well, actually, if you do the numbers, it's nothing like that. If you look at German losses in the opening 10 days of the Battle of Kursk, it's talking, 300 to 350 tanks is what they lose. What the Germans make in 1943 is over 11,000 tanks. So the tanks that they lose at Kursk are a tiny percentage of output for the year. It's just not, it doesn't actually cause German defeat. It's not a causal battle. And what I try to say in the book is that battles don't cause, they reveal. So the key thing
right.
about Kursk is it was just showing the balance of power at the time, that the Germans didn't have the equipment to break through. It didn't actually decide anything, it revealed it. But too much of military studies focuses on the battles, the operations, in trying to say, what do we learn about the operation and what has the operation done to sort of cause victory or defeat? And rarely that is the case.
But so basically, what you're saying is that it kind of has cause and effect reverse. So, like something like Stalingrad would reveal German weakness, for instance, and
Yeah, I mean,
that
Stalingrad,
like the whole idea of invading the Soviet Union was
well, I mean,
crazy.
they
Yeah,
invaded. This you can go into how the war was won. Because like, I'll talk about it in
yeah,
detail. But yeah, the Germans invade the Soviet Union with a much smaller air force than they can use when they attack France. So
yeah.
yeah, they actually have a very small air force, and they still have a lot of the air force protecting, fighting the British. So the German army that attacks Russia, sometimes people say, "Oh, this massive army," in some ways was weaker than the German army that attacks France. So it's an interesting indication of how the war had been going uh, to that point. And so it's revealing what goes on. I mean, a battle is only strategic, I would argue, if it happens over a piece of territory that is going to affect for future force construction. So if you lose your oil fields, that's a big
Right,
loss. All right,
right.
that's a strategic loss if you lose your oil fields in a battle because that's going to make a big difference in what happens in the future. However, if you just lose a few farm fields, that doesn't make any difference. In that case, the battle is important only in terms of relative losses, how many losses you've suffered versus how many new forces you can create, and vice versa to the other side. So it's just trying to say that don't get hung up on the dirt, on the
So,
land.
so let's bring this back to the present. How do you analyze this sort of battle for Pokrovsk? This might be Russia's first victory in two and a
Well,
half
is it
years,
again? I mean,
it's like a very tiny city. It's a very,
there's no way.
it's
First of all,
destroyed.
not
There's no
doesn't Pogrovsk
there's
doesn't
stories.
exist. It doesn't
Right. It
exist.
doesn't even exist, is what I'm
Yeah,
saying. Yeah.
Pokrovsk does no longer exist. It's been destroyed as a habited place by the war.
Right.
They have the Russians have been attacking it now since late July of 2024. So it's now been 14 months
Right.
that Pokrovsk has been the number one area of focus for the Russian military. They've lost, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands in total casualties trying to take it. They might take it soon because the Ukrainians hopefully are not going to spend a lot of troops to try and just take, to protect the dirt. What they should be doing is trying to use it to extract as high a losses on the Russians while keeping their own losses down. But Pokrovsk falling or Russia taking the area of what was the city of Pokrovsk is of no strategic difference to the war. Yeah, that doesn't affect the ability of the Ukrainians to make more force or the Russians to make more force. So the losses are what matter in that battle, not the actual place.
Right. Do you think part of like the reason why battles are maybe even less important now is in the Russian Ukraine war, there's multiple wars going on. There's this whole energy war,
Sure. Well, I
which
mean,
is
the strategic air
which
war
is
is more
maybe
interesting. Yeah.
more interesting and more important.
I've been writing a lot about the strategic air war. I mean, by far the more dynamic and scarily dynamic war of the winter is going to be what happens in this long range bombardment. That both Russia and Ukraine are building more and more long range weapons, and they're using them to more and more effect. So the Russians are clearly going to try and freeze the Ukrainians and shut off power to the Ukrainian cities and make the winter as unlivable for the Ukrainians as possible. I think we can clearly say that is now Russian strategy. The Ukrainians are going to try and break the Russian economy as much as possible.
Right.
So they've been going against oil refineries. They are now going against some electricity generation. But clearly, the Ukrainians are going more and more against economic targets, believing that is their best way to weaken Russia. And I believe they both understand that it's the ranged weaponry that is going to make a big difference in this war, which is one of the problems with how Ukraine's supporters helped Ukraine early in the war. I think they made a major mistake by not giving Ukraine the ability to attack at range. So it's taken the Ukrainians time to get to this point where they can do it. They still don't have nearly as many systems as the Russians.
So Russia has tried to attack Ukraine's energy
Yeah.
at least the last two winters, I believe.
Yeah, but
And
they're
it's
getting
caused a
better
lot
at
of,
it now.
they're getting better at it now.
They're getting better at it. And what's happened actually is Ukrainian air defense is weakening a little.
Right,
The United States has not given Ukraine much at all. I mean, they've only sold things through Europe, and they've been deliberately slow walking that for the last few months. And it's not the Shaheeds, or the Shaheeds matter. It's the Shaheeds distracting so that the higher quality missiles get in and
right,
attack the really high quality targets. And the Russians, because of weaknesses in Ukrainian air defense, and Ukraine doesn't have enough Patriots, seem to be getting more and more of the missiles on target. And that is a real problem.
right. So how could the economic war impact Russia? Because that seems
Well, if
actually
they can't
new.
buy, I mean, Ukraine,
Right.
Russia needs money. It,
Yeah.
it can't
If it
operate
can't
without.
sell oil,
I mean, the whole Putin system is based on money. It's
right,
basically spreading around capital, and the Russian war economy has been a very expensive thing for them to maintain because they've had to basically pump oil and sell it as much as possible and spend it. So if you can keep Russia from getting any new money, really limit its outside ability to generate income, the ability of the Russian economy to keep functioning will suffer.
okay. And what do you think of this is kind of my last question, but what do you think about Putin's theory of victory that he just keeps on throwing things at Ukraine and
Yeah.
someday it will collapse?
Well, this is certainly his view, but I mean, I think his view, well, his original view was Ukraine would collapse in a week. So
Right,
I'm not sure Putin is a very good analyst of Ukrainian capabilities. I think in many ways, though, he's stuck with this war. This is his war.
right,
He's terrified to get out of it because that would, in some ways, put him in a worse position. So he seems to really want to just keep fighting. But that's leadership. I mean, that's what I mean. Leaders matter.
right.
That this is very much Putin is so immersed in this war that it's his war, and I think that's why he's reluctant to talk about ending it.
Right. Do you think there are any, like the Ukraine, are there any sort of game changers? I mean, I hate that word, but are there
Well, I
anything
mean, if
that could
Ukraine
change
could,
the
if
dynamic?
it could get more and more ranged weapon, if it got a lot of tomahawks to
Right,
go with what they have, they could run a very successful campaign against the Russian economy.
right,
As long as it's based just on Ukrainian resources, they can do a lot of damage. It might not be as effective as it could be. But if you added tomahawks or a lot of Taurus missiles and let the Ukrainians fire those, that I think could be devastating to the Russians.
right. But this is still the thing that,
And
you know,
The United States is
The
not
US
send
and
Tom.
Germany won't go ahead of the United States,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Trump, I think it's kind of lessened in recent days, but plays this like will he, won't he
No,
game,
he won't.
which
He
is
won't. He won't do.
silly. I
He
mean, it's
won't. He
silly. He
won't do
won't
it.
do
I
it.
mean,
Yeah.
the idea that Trump
It's
would send
like,
tomahawks is insane.
yeah, yeah, I don't think he's ever going to do it. I mean, I would bet a lot on that. So, uh, thank you very much for talking to me. And
Delighted to be here.
thanks. The book is War and Power:
War and Power.
Who Wins Wars and Why. All
I
right.
think I have a copy here, people.
Okay.
I've got the British copy. This is the British European copy. So
Okay. But it's
um,
out in the United States now,
it's
right?
out in the United
It's
States
out in the
now,
United
different
States.
cover. So you can get it on from the publisher. It's Basic Books in the United States and Penguin in the UK.
Wherever
And you,
books are sold.
there
All
you go.
right. Take care. Bye
Take care
bye.
now.